A mafia boss who'd been told he could never father a child knelt in the mud before two abandoned kids and felt his entire world crack open in that single breath. Stefan Valenti stood there in his three-piece suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, the fabric still pristine despite the filth soaking through to his knees, and his eyes locked onto the girl, clutching a newborn against her bony chest, as if that baby were the only thing keeping her alive. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, but those eyes carried a weight he recognized instantly, the same hollow emptiness he felt every night when he walked back into his penthouse and found nothing but silence and shadows waiting for him, the same void that had swallowed his marriage to Bryn whole, turning two people who shared a last name into strangers who ate at opposite ends of a 12-seat table without exchanging a single word. The only difference was this girl had someone to protect. For 15 years, Stefan had built an empire from blood and concrete, controlled half of Chicago's underground, accumulated more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, bought judges, buried enemies, bent the city to his will, but he'd never been able to buy the one thing he actually wanted, and the doctors had made sure he knew he never would, that his bloodline, the Valenti name his grandfather had killed to preserve, would die with him. And now, kneeling in the mud outside an abandoned warehouse on the south side, a warehouse that sat on his territory, in his world, he'd found two children who needed exactly what he had to give, but had never been allowed to. He said his name slowly, extending his hand the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might bolt or bite, and the girl pressed herself harder against the rotting wall, calculating the danger with a precision that made his chest tighten, because it was the same calculation he made in rooms full of men who wanted him dead, except she was gambling with her own life. Phoebe, her voice so small he almost missed it. "My name's Phoebe." Then she told him the baby in her arms was her brother, Theo, that their mama had left 3 days ago, promised she'd come back but never did, and the girl said it all without a flicker of emotion in her voice, as if she were recounting the weather or what she'd had for breakfast. And it was that flatness, that terrible rehearsed calm of a child who'd already learned that crying changed nothing, that split Stefan Valenti clean in half. If this story touched something inside you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what Stefan doesn't know yet is that bringing these two children home won't just change his life. It'll force him to choose between the empire he built and the family he never thought he'd have. Stefan called Orion in a voice the man who'd fought in Fallujah had never heard. Not a commanding voice, not a threatening one, but the voice of someone trying to stay calm and not knowing how. "Bring the car here, now." Orion didn't ask, didn't need to, because in 8 years as Stefan Valenti's right hand, he'd learned that when his boss spoke like that, everything had slipped past the usual rules. The armored Escalade stopped in front of the warehouse in under 10 minutes, headlights sweeping through the dark like twin blades, and Orion stepped out, then froze when he saw what was in front of him. His boss, the man half of Chicago, trembled at the sound of his name, standing in a field of mud with a ragged little girl clutching a newborn, a suit worth tens of thousands of dollars now caked with dirt from the knees down, and his eyes holding something Orion had never seen in 8 years, something that looked like fear. Orion opened the back door without saying a word, and Stefan reached out a hand to Phoebe, but she didn't take it. She only looked into the car, at the cream-colored leather seats, at the soft interior light, at a world completely unlike anything she'd ever known. Then she looked down at her own feet, bare, muddy, scraped, raw, and said in a voice so small the wind almost swallowed it, "Will I dirty your car?" Those 4 words hit Stefan's chest harder than any bullet he'd ever dodged, because this 6-year-old wasn't afraid of being hit, wasn't afraid of being abandoned one more time. She was afraid of dirtying a stranger's seat, afraid that the only thing keeping her from going back to that mud was whether she was clean enough to be allowed to sit on leather. Stefan knelt again, this time right beside the open door, met her eyes, and spoke slowly. "Get in, sweetheart. It's just a car." Phoebe climbed in with tiny steps, so careful it was like the floor might give out beneath her. She perched on the very edge of the seat with only a quarter of her body, back stiff as a board, both arms locked around Theo, eyes fixed straight ahead, too scared to touch anything. Orion drove, glancing up at the rearview mirror every few seconds, and what he saw there made him grip the wheel tighter. Stefan Valenti sitting beside a 6-year-old with the face of a man who didn't know what to do, and that was something Orion had never seen on his boss: helplessness. Theo started to cry, not the sharp wail of a healthy newborn, but a weak, thin moan. the cry of a baby so exhausted he didn't have enough breath left to be loud, and that sound cut through the air inside the SUV like a blade. Phoebe immediately began rocking her brother, lips moving in whispers Stefan couldn't make out. But he recognized the rhythm as soothing, words a 6-year-old shouldn't know how to say, because she shouldn't have to be a mother to her own baby brother. "He's hungry," Phoebe said without looking at Stefan, her voice still flat the way it had been when she talked about her mother. "I haven't had anything to feed him since yesterday." Stefan leaned forward. "Orion, stop at the nearest pharmacy. Anywhere that's open." The 24-hour Walgreens on Ashland Avenue glowed under harsh white fluorescent light in the middle of the night, and Stefan walked in like a ghost from another world. Brioni's suit smeared with mud from the knees down, $4,000 Oxfords ruined, hair slipping out of its perfect slick. Standing in the baby aisle with the eyes of a man who'd been thrown into territory that didn't speak his language. He stared at rows of formula without knowing which one was for a newborn, didn't know what diaper size fit, didn't know which bottle wouldn't make a baby choke. For 15 years he'd run an empire without hesitation, making split-second decisions involving millions of dollars and human lives. But in front of a diaper shelf, he felt like he was reading a language he'd never learned. A night shift clerk came closer, a young woman with a ponytail, eyes wide at the sight of the suit and the mud, asking if he needed help, and Stefan said in a voice he barely recognized as his own, "I need everything for a newborn, formula, bottles, diapers, and food for a 6-year-old girl. Whatever you've got." The clerk didn't ask more, maybe because his eyes were saying more than any explanation ever could, and she started pulling items from the shelves: newborn formula, wide-neck anti-choke bottles, newborn diapers, wipes, diaper rash cream, and a prepackaged sandwich with a small carton of fruit juice from the snack section. Stefan paid without looking at the receipt, stuffed everything into 2 large bags, then walked back out to the SUV where Orion stood guard outside, and Phoebe still sat inside holding Theo tight, back rigid, eyes glued to the window like she was memorizing every street in case she ever needed to find her way back. Stefan opened the formula with fingers that 3 hours earlier had signed an order to move $2 million into a laundering account in the Cayman Islands, read the mixing instructions under the dome light, measured each scoop with the focus he usually reserved for life and death deals. And when he poured warm water from the bottle Orion had bought into the baby bottle, his hands shook, not from cold, not from fear the way he'd always understood fear, but because he was holding something more fragile than anything he'd ever touched, and he was terrified of breaking it. He handed the bottle to Phoebe. She took it with both hands like it was treasure, guided the nipple to Theo's mouth, and the baby drank with a silent desperation, tiny fingers pawing at the air, and Phoebe watched him with eyes that held something like relief, and also a pain deeper than any child should carry. The look of someone forced to be responsible for another life before she was big enough to protect her own. Stefan offered the sandwich to Phoebe. She looked at it, looked at him, then unwrapped it slowly, carefully, making sure not a single crumb fell, then took her first bite and chewed so slowly. Stefan had to turn his face away because he couldn't watch it without feeling something inside his chest, tightening to the point of suffocation, because she ate the way someone eats when she's been hungry long enough to know every bite might be the last. And he thought of the dinner he hadn't bothered to touch tonight, a 12-seat table laid in crisp white linen in the penthouse, him at one end and Bryn at the other, separated by 3.5 meters of silence, food cooked by a private chef cooling on porcelain while they both pretended the other's presence didn't exist, and now a 6-year-old was eating a cheap pharmacy sandwich like it was the best meal of her life. The private elevator opened onto the penthouse floor a little before 2 o'clock in the morning, and the first thing Stefan saw was that the living room lights were still on, which meant Bryn wasn't asleep, which meant she was sitting with a book in the corner of the sofa, the way she did every night, because that was how she locked herself inside her own world, so she wouldn't have to admit she was living in the penthouse of a man she hated. Stefan stepped out with Phoebe close behind him, the little girl still holding Theo tight, her bare feet touching the marble and curling back as if the cold stone could swallow her, and behind them, Orion carried 2 pharmacy bags with the face of a man trying to understand how the world had just flipped upside down. Bryn heard the footsteps, looked up from her book, and everything that came after happened inside a silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds, and felt to Stefan like 3 years. She saw him first, the mud on his suit, his hair fallen out of its perfect place. Then her eyes moved down, and she saw the child, saw Phoebe, saw the torn, filthy clothes, the bruised bare feet, the newborn wrapped in a scrap of fabric that didn't look clean enough to wipe a floor, and the book slipped from her hands, but she didn't pick it up. Bryn stood, her gaze moving from the children to Stefan and back again. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, and that was how Stefan knew she was truly angry. Because Bryn Calloway never shouted when she was angry for real. She went cold, her voice dropped lower, and each word came out clean and sharp like a scalpel she'd used in the emergency room. You brought kids here. It wasn't a question. You didn't call 911. You didn't call DCFS. You didn't call the police. You, Stefan Valenti, the boss the FBI tracked step by step, brought 2 abandoned children into your penthouse at 2 a.m. like you were carrying a package and not 2 human beings. Stefan set the bags on the floor, slow and controlled, the way he always moved when he was challenged, and he met Bryn's eyes. If I call DCFS, they'll separate them. The 6-year-old goes to one home, the newborn goes to another. You know how that system works. The last line hit exactly where Stefan meant it to hit, and he hated himself for using it, but he needed her to stop looking at him like that, with the eyes of a wife staring at her husband and seeing only a criminal. Bryn didn't move, and Stefan watched the moment his words pushed through her anger and touched something deeper, something she'd buried carefully, but never deeply enough. When she was 7, Illinois foster care split Bryn from her biological brother, a 10-year-old boy named Jamie, the only person in the world who'd ever held her hand while she cried, and they sent them to different families on opposite sides of the city, then different cities, then different states. And Bryn didn't see Jamie again until 17 years later, when she got a call from a hospital in Gary, Indiana, telling her brother had died of a drug overdose in a cheap rented room, and the only thing they found in his pocket was an old worn photograph of 2 children sitting on the steps of a temporary house, a brown-haired little girl and a brown-haired boy, holding hands, smiling, before the system tore them into 2 pieces and never put them back together. She didn't say any of it out loud, didn't tell Stefan he was right, because admitting Stefan Valenti was right about anything went against every rule she'd set for herself inside this marriage, but she didn't argue either, and that silence said more than any confession could. Then Bryn looked at Phoebe, really looked at her for the first time without the lens of anger aimed at Stefan, and what she saw shifted something inside her. The girl stood in a living room bigger than the warehouse she'd just come from, dirty feet on polished marble, ripped clothes beneath paintings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, holding her brother with thin arms where blue veins rose under the skin, and her eyes didn't take in the luxury with wonder or hunger. She looked at everything with calculation, searching for an exit, measuring the distance to the door, deciding whether the woman in front of her was a threat. And Bryn recognized that look because she'd looked at the world with that same look for the first 20 years of her life. The look of a child who'd learned anyone could disappear at any moment, so never trust, never let go. Never let anyone close enough that their leaving could hurt. Bryn walked to Phoebe and knelt down, slow and deliberate, not the kind of kneeling in mud that Stefan had done, but the kneel of a nurse at a pediatric bedside, eye level, not threatening, not rushed, letting the child decide the next move. Phoebe stepped back half a step on instinct, but her back hit the wall, and there was nowhere left to go, so she stayed still, holding Theo tight, staring at the woman kneeling in front of her, with old eyes measuring every millimeter of space between them. Bryn didn't touch her, didn't reach out, didn't make a single gesture that could be mistaken for trying to take the baby away. She only spoke in the gentlest voice she had, the voice she used in pediatric emergency when a child was panicking and needed to believe someone would stay. What's your brother's name? Not what's your name, not are you okay, not don't be scared, but what's your brother's name? Because Bryn understood that for this child, her brother was everything. Her brother was the reason she was still standing, and asking about him was how Bryn told Phoebe, I see you. I see what matters most to you, and I'm not here to take it. Phoebe watched Bryn for a long time, long enough that Stefan stood behind them holding his breath without realizing it. Then something in those old eyes shifted. Not trust. It was too soon for trust, but something right at the threshold of it. A tiny crack. And for the first time since Stefan had found her in the warehouse, Phoebe loosened her hold on Theo, just a little, only enough to let her chest pull in a deeper breath, like she'd finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to squeeze until she couldn't breathe to keep her brother safe anymore. Bryn rose from the floor and spoke to Stefan in a voice that wasn't angry anymore. It had shifted into a nurse's voice, clipped, clear, with no room for extra emotion. I need warm water, clean towels, and the sink in the guest bathroom on this floor. The baby needs a bath right now." Stefan nodded and led her to the guest bathroom, a room of white marble with gold-plated fixtures no one had used since the day this penthouse was built, and he turned on warm water into the sink, while Bryn went back to the living room where Phoebe still stood frozen on the floor. Bryn knelt again and said, "Can you let me hold your brother for a minute, sweetheart? I'm only going to bathe him. You stand right here and watch. You don't take your eyes off him for even 1 second." Phoebe looked at Bryn, then toward the bathroom, then down at Theo, lying still in her arms, and she nodded. A tiny nod you could barely see, then transferred her brother into Bryn's arms with a care so precise, it was like the baby was made of glass. Bryn carried Theo into the bathroom, and Phoebe followed close behind exactly as promised, standing in the doorway, eyes never leaving her brother. When Bryn unwrapped the cloth around Theo, her hands stopped and her face changed. Stefan stood behind Phoebe and looked in, and he saw what Bryn was seeing. The baby's body was too small in a way that wasn't normal. Ribs outlined beneath skin thin as paper, his belly swollen in a way Bryn knew meant severe malnutrition and not fullness. Arms and legs like sticks, skin gray and bloodless. Bryn lowered Theo into the warm water so gently the surface barely rippled, and the baby didn't cry when he touched the water. He only startled weakly and went still, too exhausted to react, and it was that quiet that made Bryn bite down hard to keep her hands from shaking, because a healthy newborn would scream when lowered into unfamiliar water. Theo's silence wasn't calm, it was collapse. Bryn bathed him with motions she'd never imagined she'd use inside this penthouse in the last 18 months. Motions she'd learned in the pediatric ward of a public hospital on the south side, where abandoned children were brought into the emergency room at midnight, and she had to wash them, examine them, keep them alive until the system decided where to throw them next. She used a soft cloth to clean each finger, each fold of skin, and when she lifted Theo's left leg, she saw an old bruise at his ankle, and she drew in a small breath but didn't speak, she only memorized it. When she was done, Bryn wrapped Theo in a white bath towel 3 times bigger than his body, and she held him in one arm while the other hand motioned Phoebe closer. "Your turn now. Let me see your foot." Phoebe shook her head and stepped back on instinct. But Bryn had already seen it. The moment the girl walked on marble, she'd seen the way she shifted her weight to her right leg and kept her left from taking the full load, and now under the bathroom light she could clearly see Phoebe's left sole swollen and raw, yellow pus seeping from a cut that had turned infected, the skin around it hot, and the redness already climbing toward her ankle. Bryn placed Theo into Stefan's hands without asking, without pleading. She simply put him there as if it was obvious, and Stefan took the baby with 2 stiff hands, holding him a few inches from his chest because he didn't know whether to pull him close, and Theo lay in the hands of Chicago's Mafia boss, like he was resting on a warm rock, trying to pretend it was a cradle. Bryn knelt in front of Phoebe, lifted her left foot gently, and Phoebe hissed in pain but didn't cry. Didn't cry because this child had forgotten how a long time ago. "This needs antibiotics," Bryn said to Stefan without turning her head. "And the baby needs a pediatrician right now. Not tomorrow morning, right now." Stefan held Theo with one arm and used the other to pull out his phone and call Dr. Faith Nguyen, the only woman outside the underworld he trusted enough to call at 2:30 in the morning, the pediatrician who'd stitched wounds on his men without asking questions, and in return, Stefan paid every bill for the free clinic she ran on the west side. Dr. Faith arrived within 40 minutes, hair twisted up fast, eyes still heavy with sleep, but her hands already carrying her medical bag. And when she saw Theo, her face shifted from ordinary to something Stefan recognized as professional composure, hiding worry. She examined Theo first, weighed him, measured him, checked reflexes, listened to heart and lungs, and when she looked up at Stefan, her voice was steady but her eyes weren't. "The baby's severely malnourished, dehydrated. He needs a special feeding plan. High-calorie formula, every 2 hours, even overnight, and if he doesn't improve in 48 hours, he needs to be admitted." She turned to Phoebe, examined the wound on her foot, and shook her head slightly. "The infection's spreading, but it hasn't reached her bloodstream yet. High-dose antibiotics for 10 days. Keep it clean. Change the dressing twice a day." She wrote prescriptions, handed them to Bryn, then looked at Stefan again with an expression he couldn't decode. Not judgment, not pity, something closer to curiosity, like she was wondering if this man understood what he'd just stepped into. After Dr. Faith left, Bryn mixed the special formula the doctor had brought, fed Theo, and when the baby finished and began to fall asleep in her arms, Bryn walked him through the kitchen. Slow steps, a gentle sway, and from her mouth came a small melody. No clear words, just soft, low notes. A lullaby she couldn't remember learning, maybe from one foster mother in the long chain of foster mothers who came and went through her life, or maybe from a biological mother whose face she couldn't recall. But the melody was still there, tucked deep inside a drawer of memory she thought she'd locked years ago. Stefan stood at the kitchen doorway with his back to the wall and listened. In 18 months of living together, he'd heard Bryn shut her bedroom door, heard her footsteps on the floor when she thought he wasn't paying attention, heard the empty, polite sentences at breakfast before she vanished all day. But he'd never heard her sing, never heard a sound from her that carried anything beyond chill distance or restrained contempt. And that small lullaby rising in the kitchen at 3 a.m. was the first sound that made this penthouse feel like someone lived here instead of simply existed. Phoebe refused to sleep in a bed. She looked at the huge guest room and the king-size bed Bryn had made with fresh sheets, shook her head, and said, "Can I sleep on the sofa?" Then, without waiting for an answer, she climbed onto the couch, curled into a ball, pulled Theo to her chest, and closed her eyes in a defensive posture, even in sleep, back turned outward to shield her brother, both arms around him, ready to squeeze tight and run if anything happened. Bryn draped a thin blanket over the two children, and when she stood and turned back, she saw Stefan in the middle of the living room, arms hanging at his sides, staring at the children sleeping on his couch with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not weakness. Stefan Valenti wasn't weak, but something that looked inward and found emptiness. They stood there in the living room, 2 meters apart, closer than the distance across the 12-seat dining table, but still far, and for the first time in 18 months, they looked at each other without an invisible wall between them. Or maybe the wall was still there, but there were 2 children sleeping on the couch, and the wall suddenly mattered less. Bryn spoke first, her voice low so she wouldn't wake them. "I'll stay and take care of them. I'll feed Theo every 2 hours, change Phoebe's bandage, make sure she takes her antibiotics on time. I'll do all of it, but I'm staying for them, not for you. Do you understand?" Stefan looked at her, at eyes that for 18 months had given him nothing but coldness, and now were lit by something he'd never seen turned in his direction. Even if that light wasn't for him but for the 2 children behind him, it was still there, in this room, in the air between them, and it was more than he'd ever had in this marriage. He nodded. That was enough. On the first morning, Theo's crying rang out at 6 o'clock, and Stefan opened his eyes on the couch in his office where he'd managed to lie back for a few hours, needing 2 seconds to remember why there was a baby crying inside his own penthouse. Then he got up and walked into the living room, where Bryn had already lifted Theo into her arms, dark circles under her eyes from waking every 2 hours to feed him exactly on the schedule Dr. Faith had given. Stefan stood beside her, watched the baby wail in Bryn's arms, then said, "Let me hold him. Go rest for a bit." Bryn handed Theo over without arguing, because she was too tired to fight, and Stefan held the baby with 2 stiff hands, keeping him away from his chest like he was holding a bomb. And Theo cried louder. Phoebe appeared from the sofa, hair tangled, eyes watchful as always, and she looked at Stefan holding her brother with the assessing stare of someone who'd held that baby hundreds of times. Then she said in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, "You have to support his head. Hold him close so he can hear your heart. He likes that." Stefan looked at the 6-year-old teaching him how to hold a newborn, and did what she said, pulling Theo against his chest, supporting the head with his palm. And the baby stopped crying almost immediately, lying still to listen to the heartbeat of Chicago's Mafia boss, beating faster than usual. Outside the penthouse door, Orion stood guard on the morning shift, heard the baby's crying carry out and then cut off, heard small feet running on the floor, heard Stefan's voice say something he couldn't quite catch, but the tone was completely unfamiliar. And Orion Banks, a man who'd once watched his boss order a traitor handled without blinking, now stood outside that door with the pure confusion of someone watching something that didn't fit a single scenario he'd ever been trained to manage. The days after that repeated in a new rhythm no one in this penthouse had ever known. Bryn fed Theo, changed Phoebe's bandage, took temperatures, wrote down medication times in a small notebook. Stefan fumbled his way into the gaps with the things he could do, holding Theo when Bryn needed both hands free, driving out to buy more formula and diapers when they ran low, sitting beside Phoebe while she ate breakfast. And Phoebe ate everything. She ate everything that was put in front of her. But at every meal, Bryn noticed a slice of bread disappeared from the plate and reappeared in the coat pocket of the jacket Bryn had loaned her, folded neat, tucked deep. Bryn didn't speak, didn't take it out, didn't explain that she didn't have to do that because she wouldn't go hungry here. Because Bryn knew words wouldn't work, because 20 years ago she'd done the same thing, hiding bread in her own pockets, in every new foster house. Not only because she was hungry, but because it was the only thing she could control in a world where everything else could be taken at any moment. So instead of talking, every morning Bryn quietly placed an extra slice of bread beside Phoebe's breakfast, like it was an accident, like there was always more, so the girl could hide it without shame. On the 4th day, Phoebe still hid the bread, but she ate more. On the 6th day, she hid less. By the end of the week, the slice stayed on the plate, and Phoebe didn't hide it anymore. And Bryn knew it was the first sign the girl was starting to believe the next meal would come. On the 5th day, Phoebe ran a fever. Not high, but enough to worry Bryn because of the antibiotics and the way the girl's immune system had been worn thin. Bryn called Dr. Faith for guidance, and she said to watch her through the night. If the fever climbed, then bring her into the clinic. Stefan was halfway to a meeting with 3 captains who controlled the northern lines. A meeting he'd postponed twice and couldn't postpone again without losing face. And when Orion texted that the girl had a fever, Stefan told him to turn the car around. Orion glanced into the rearview mirror. Boss, that meeting. Stefan didn't repeat himself. Orion turned the car. That night, Stefan sat in the chair beside the sofa where Phoebe lay, not sleeping, watching her breathe through feverish sleep, sometimes placing his hand on her forehead to check her temperature in a way he didn't know he'd learned, maybe from a faint memory of his grandfather's hand on his forehead the last time before he died. Bryn woke at 3 to feed Theo, passed through the living room, and saw Stefan still sitting there, head slightly tilted, eyes on Phoebe, his hand resting on the blanket near the girl's hand but not touching, and Bryn paused in the hallway shadows and watched for 10 seconds before she turned away. And in those 10 seconds, for the first time since the day she'd signed the marriage papers, she wondered if beneath the ice she'd always believed was the whole of him, something was starting to melt. Phoebe's fever broke the next morning, and Stefan went to the meeting one day late, without explaining anything to anyone. On the 7th night, Bryn woke to Theo, crying, walked into the living room, and found Stefan sitting in the dark, not beside the sofa this time, but in the armchair facing the wall, where the only photograph in the entire penthouse hung, a portrait of his grandfather, the man who'd built the foundation of the Valenti Empire, and raised Stefan after he was orphaned. Bryn didn't turn away this time. She placed Theo in the crib Stefan had bought the day before, then walked to the living room and sat in the chair beside him without speaking, without asking if he was okay because they both knew the question meant nothing inside their marriage. The silence stretched. Then Stefan said, "My grandfather died in this room 3 years ago. Before he died, the only thing he said he regretted was that he wouldn't see the Valenti line continue, and I've carried that sentence inside me every day since. Every night when I sit here, I hear it repeat, and I don't have an answer." He stopped. Until last week, Bryn didn't speak. She didn't need to. She only sat there in the dark beside him, and her shoulder touched his. Light, maybe accidental, maybe not, but neither of them moved away, and it was the first time in 18 months those two had been side by side, without the distance of a 12-seat table, without the required coldness, without the wall, only darkness, the portrait on the wall, the soft breathing of 2 sleeping children, and 2 broken people sitting close for the first time. Grant Whitmore came to the penthouse on the afternoon of the 10th day, on time as always, gray suit, brown leather briefcase, the expressionless face of a man who'd kept Valenti family secrets for 30 years. But when he stepped through the door and saw the tiny children's shoes lined up beside Stefan's Oxfords in the entryway, saw the crib set up next to the living room sofa, saw a baby bottle on the coffee table where there was usually only whiskey, he paused for exactly 1 beat before pulling out a chair in the office and opening his briefcase without comment. Stefan sat across from him, and Grant began speaking in a lawyer's voice, instead of the voice of someone who'd known him for 3 decades. Under Illinois law, you're keeping 2 children without any legal standing. If DCFS finds out, or if anyone reports it, they'll come take them immediately, and you'll face criminal charges. The only legal route is to file for temporary guardianship through family court, and that comes with a home study, meaning a DCFS worker will come, inspect the residence, interview both spouses, run background checks, assess living conditions, and this is where everything gets complicated. Grant opened a thick file, set it on the desk, and looked Stefan straight in the eye. The FBI opened a surveillance file on you 7 years ago. Federal prosecutor Preston Hale has made taking down the Valenti empire his personal mission. He spent 5 years collecting evidence, but not enough to indict. And if you file for guardianship, your name will enter the DCFS system. Preston Hale will know, and he'll use this as leverage, not to save the children, but to open a wider investigation into your finances, into the organization, into everything you've built for 15 years. Stefan listened without blinking, his face still, but his jaw tightened and Grant knew what that meant. Grant went on. However, you have one advantage. Most men in your position don't. You have a legal wife. On paper, you're the CEO of an investment firm, stable housing, legitimate income, and a marriage that's lasted 18 months. A guardianship petition from a married couple with strong finances and a respectable home is far stronger than one from a single man, and if both spouses sign and both appear in court, your odds rise significantly. Grant finished and watched Stefan, and in the silence that followed, they both knew the real problem wasn't the law or Preston Hale. It was whether the woman down the hall, the woman who'd signed the marriage papers for a debt and not for love, would agree to turn a paper marriage into a shield for 2 children. Bryn stood at the doorway of the kids' room, where she'd just laid Theo into the crib after his afternoon feeding, and she'd heard everything. Not because she was trying to listen, but because the penthouse was open, and Grant's voice carried, and there was only one sharp thought in her mind. The marriage she'd signed because she'd had no other choice, the marriage she'd treated like a sentence, was now the only thing that could keep 2 children from being thrown into the same system that had crushed her life and killed her brother. Stefan appeared at the end of the hallway and looked at her, and he didn't need to ask whether she'd heard, because the answer was written on her face. He asked only one question, his voice low, not an order, but a voice Bryn had never heard him use with her before, almost a request. "Are you willing?" Bryn looked at him, then passed his shoulder into the room where Phoebe sat on the floor beside Theo's crib, guarding her brother's sleep with unblinking eyes. Then she looked back at Stefan. "For them? Yes, not for you." She didn't need to say the rest. They both understood the boundary. But when Bryn turned back toward the kids' room and Stefan returned to the office with Grant, they both knew this second agreement wasn't the first one. The first had been an exchange between strangers. This one had 2 sleeping children sitting in the middle of it, and when children are in the middle, nothing is ever completely an act. Stefan sat down across from Grant, and the lawyer looked at his boss with an expression. 30 years serving the Valenti family had taught him never to show worry. He said, "Stefan, you understand this can destroy everything you've built. The organization, the empire, all of it. If Preston Hale uses a guardianship case to drag everything into the light, you could lose not only the children, but your freedom." Stefan met him with the eyes everyone in Chicago's underworld knew not to challenge. Eyes that had made captains bow, made traitors tremble, made judges look away, and he said 2 words in a voice, no louder than a whisper, but heavier than any order he'd given in 15 years. "Find a way." 2 weeks after Grant filed the petition for temporary guardianship, Orion called Stefan at 10 o'clock at night and said 4 words, "Found the kid's mother." Jolene Perry was in a shelter for homeless women on the west side, thinner than the photo in the file Orion had dug up, eyes hollowed out, old bruises on her wrists gone yellow, and when Orion found her, she was sitting on a bunk bed in a shared room with 12 other women, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at a wall. Jolene's story wasn't a story Stefan wanted to hear, but it was one he needed to. She was 24, addicted to opioids since she was 17, controlled by a trafficking ring since she was 19, selling her body on the streets of the South Side to pay off the debt to the people who'd trapped her inside a spiral she couldn't climb out of. 3 days before Stefan found Phoebe and Theo, Jolene had left the warehouse to go find help. She'd heard there was a charity on Halstead that could give her food and a temporary place to stay, but she never made it there, because on the way 2 men from the ring caught her, beat her, locked her in the basement of an abandoned house for 3 days because she'd dared to run, and when they finally let her go, she went back to the warehouse, and the children were gone. Orion read the report in an even voice inside Stefan's office, and when he finished, silence fell on the room heavier than anything Stefan had ever felt in the bloody interrogations he'd overseen. Because the trafficking ring that controlled Jolene operated on Southside territory, his territory, and it stayed alive because it paid protection fees to the Valenti organization every month, money Stefan had never bothered to check the source of, because it was too small next to the empire, too small to be worth his attention. but big enough to hold a 24-year-old woman in hell and leave 2 children abandoned in a warehouse, nearly starving to death. Stefan didn't speak after Orion finished. He just sat there staring at the surface of the desk, and the darkness in his office suddenly carried a different weight. Not the familiar darkness of power and secrets, but the darkness of knowing that the same hands that had shaken while mixing Theo's formula weeks ago were the hands that had signed off on the protection system that kept the baby's mother imprisoned. Bryn learned the next morning, not because Stefan told her, but because she heard him on the phone with Grant in the office, the door not fully closed, and when she walked in with Theo in her arms, her face had gone white. She laid Theo in the crib, slow and controlled, then turned to Stefan. And this explosion was different from the first night he'd brought the children home. That night had been the cold anger of a wife watching her husband do something reckless. This was something deeper, something that hurt more, her voice trembling not from fear but because what she was feeling was too big to fit inside her chest. You were the rescuer and the cause. Do you understand that? You found 2 children dying in a warehouse and brought them home like a hero, but your empire locked their mother away so she couldn't come back. Your protection money fed the people who turned her into a slave. You saved the aftermath, but you were the reason. Stefan stood there and took it. Didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. Didn't snap back with logic or power the way he always did. And Bryn noticed. She realized that this silence wasn't the arrogant silence of a boss who treated criticism like a mosquito. It was the silence of a man standing in front of a mirror and seeing his own face clearly for the first time, and not being able to bear what he saw. She stopped mid-sentence, breath heavy, and looked at him. Really looked. And in Stefan's eyes there was no defense, no wall, only something that looked like shame, raw and undiluted. And Bryn had never seen Stefan Valenti ashamed of anything since the day she met him. She turned away, lifted Theo, left the room without another word, and Stefan stayed alone inside the silence she'd left behind, heavier than any sentence Preston Hale could ever hand down. That night, after the children were asleep, Stefan called Orion into the office and gave an order in the voice Orion recognized immediately as the old voice of his boss, cold, precise, no room for hesitation. The ring-controlling Jolene Perry. I want every name, every address, every street they work. And I want them gone from my territory in 48 hours. Not moved. Gone. Orion nodded and left the room. And 48 hours later, the trafficking ring that had controlled Jolene no longer existed. Not because of the law, not because of DCFS, but because Chicago's Mafia boss decided it didn't get to exist. And that was the only kind of justice Stefan's world knew how to enforce. Bryn didn't ask what happened, but she knew. She knew because she'd lived in his world long enough to read what wasn't said. And that night, as she lay in her own room staring at the ceiling, she realized something that scared her more than anything Stefan had ever done. She didn't condemn it. Not completely, because one part of her, the part she hated admitting was there, understood that there were some evils that could only be erased by another evil, and that understanding was what was truly terrifying. Not because of what it said about Stefan, but because of what it said about her. The meeting was set at the DCFS office on West Randolph on a Tuesday morning. A small room with an old wooden table, flickering fluorescent lights, and a social worker sitting in the corner with a notebook. Everything gray and cold, in the way only system buildings know how to be cold. Phoebe sat between Stefan and Bryn on the plastic chairs in the waiting area, back straight, eyes sweeping the hallway the way she always swept every new room looking for an exit, and her hand was locked around Bryn's hand, not Stefan's, her tiny fingers squeezing Bryn's knuckles hard enough to bleach them white. And Bryn squeezed back, because she understood that a child doesn't choose the strongest hand to hold. She chooses the hand she believes won't let go. Stefan watched the way the girl held his wife's hand and said nothing, but something passed through his eyes. Not jealousy, not hurt, something closer to the recognition that in the war for Phoebe's trust, Bryn had gone much farther than he had, and maybe that was the way it should be. The meeting room door opened and the social worker invited them in, and when the 3 of them sat on one side of the table, Phoebe started to tremble, not from cold but from somewhere deeper, the tremble of a child who knows something is about to change and can't tell which direction it will change in. Then the door opened again, and Jolene walked in. She was thinner than she'd been 2 weeks earlier when Orion found her, but clean, hair tied back, wearing clothes the shelter had given her, and her eyes Stefan recognized instantly as the older version of Phoebe's, swept the room and stopped on her daughter. Jolene collapsed into the chair across from them and broke into sobs before she could say anything, both hands reaching across the table toward Phoebe. "Baby, my baby, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Phoebe looked at her mother, and in her eyes there were 10 emotions at once that no 6-year-old should have to carry. Longing, anger, fear, love, the part of her that wanted to run into her mother's arms, and the part that wanted to step back behind Bryn, and in the end, she stood, walked around the table, and let her mother hold her, but she didn't let go of Bryn's hand until the distance made it impossible. Jolene held her daughter and cried without sound, shoulders shaking, face pressed into Phoebe's hair, and Phoebe hugged her back but didn't cry. She just stood there inside her mother's arms with her eyes open, looking over Jolene's shoulder at Bryn as if checking that the other woman was still there, still not going anywhere. Then Phoebe spoke, her voice small but clear in the quiet room. "Mom, I want to see you, but I'm scared you'll take me away from where I am. I'm safe there, Mom. I eat every day. Theo's getting better. Miss Bryn sings to Theo every night." Jolene pulled back, hands still on her daughter's shoulders, staring into Phoebe's eyes, and what she saw there broke her in a way even years under the ring's control had never managed, because her daughter was telling her she'd found safety, and that safety wasn't with her mother. Jolene looked up toward the other side of the table, and her gaze landed on Stefan, and Stefan saw her recognize him, not the man himself, but the name, because on the streets of the South Side, the name Valenti is whispered in the dark among girls like Jolene, with the same feeling people whisper the name of a storm, knowing it's there, knowing you can't outrun it, only hoping it won't sweep over you. "You're the one who saved my children?" Jolene asked, and her voice carried something that was gratitude and confusion at the same time. "Why? Who are you to care about the kids of a drug-addicted street prostitute?" The silence stretched. The social worker stopped writing. Bryn looked at Stefan. Stefan looked at Jolene for a long time before he answered, his voice low, carrying nothing of the boss, and only the shape of a truth he'd never said to anyone except the walls of darkness in his penthouse. "Because I was a kid nobody wanted to." Jolene stared at him like she was trying to decide if that was real or just another kind of manipulation she'd learned to expect on the street. But what she saw in Stefan's eyes wasn't a trick. She saw truth, raw material you can't fake, and she believed him. She started crying again, this time not only for her daughter but for herself, for her life, for everything that had gone wrong since she'd been smaller than Phoebe. "I know I can't raise them," Jolene said through tears. "I don't have a home. I don't have a job. I've only been clean for 2 weeks and I don't know how long I can hold it. But please don't let me lose them completely. Don't let them forget me." Bryn stood, walked around the table, and knelt in front of Jolene at eye level, the way she'd knelt in front of Phoebe on the first night in the penthouse, and she took the hand of a woman she'd never met, but understood more deeply than anyone else in that room, because Bryn knew what it was to lose a brother to the system, knew what it was to grow up unwanted, and she wouldn't let that happen to these 2 children. "Nobody wants to separate you from your children," Bryn said, and her voice was steadier than it had ever been in her life. "I promise you, I'll care for them like they're mine, but you'll always be their mother. Always. And they'll know that." Jolene looked at Bryn, then at Stefan, then at Phoebe, standing by the table watching everything with old eyes, and she nodded slowly. "I agree to temporary guardianship," she told the social worker, but her eyes stayed on Bryn. "On the condition that I can visit them. I need to know they're okay. I need them to know I didn't leave because I didn't love them." The social worker nodded and wrote it down, and the meeting ended with an embrace between Jolene and Phoebe that no one in the room dared interrupt, Jolene whispering into her daughter's ear words only the 2 of them could hear. Then she let go, wiped her eyes, stood, and walked out without turning back, because she knew if she looked back, she wouldn't have the strength to keep walking forward. 8 months passed, and the penthouse on the top floor became a place Stefan no longer recognized, in the best way he could have imagined. Phoebe went to a private school in Lincoln Park, caught up within 3 months, and by the 4th month she was at the top of her class. Her teacher called Bryn and said the girl had an extraordinary memory and reading comprehension far beyond her age, and Bryn listened and cried in the bathroom where no one could see because she didn't want to explain why a child reading well could make her cry. Theo grew so fast, Dr. Faith had to weigh him every 2 weeks, and each time she nodded with quiet satisfaction. The skeletal baby from that night was now a chubby little boy with round eyes and an easy laugh, and on a Saturday afternoon, when Bryn was washing dishes in the kitchen, and Stefan was sitting on the living room floor reading financial reports. Theo pulled himself up on the edge of the coffee table, stood on trembling legs, then took 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps toward Stefan before he toppled forward into Stefan's lap. Stefan caught him on reflex. Bryn ran out from the kitchen, and both of them spoke at the same time. "He's walking." And then they clapped, and Phoebe ran in and wrapped her arms around her brother, squealing. And in the laughter and applause, Stefan looked up at Bryn, and Bryn looked down at him, their eyes meeting over the baby's head, as Theo sat in Stefan's lap, grinning wide, and in that moment, nobody had to say it out loud. They both knew that what was between them hadn't been a deal for a long time. Maybe since that night their shoulders touched in the dark. Maybe since the morning Bryn said coffee instead of sorry. Maybe even earlier. But it was certain now, right here, on the living room floor with a newly walking baby and a little girl spinning in circles around them. The fake marriage had died, and nobody had held a funeral for it. Then the storm came. Knox Wheeler, 30 years old, the lieutenant in charge of the Southern Line in the Valenti organization, the man Stefan had trusted enough to handle the most sensitive work, had secretly been working with federal prosecutor Preston Hale for 5 months. Knox knew about the arrangement marriage because he was the one who'd handled Bryn's brother's debt 2 years earlier. Knew the amount, the terms, the reason Bryn signed the papers, and he handed it all to Preston Hale on a USB drive in an underground parking garage in the Loop. Preston Hale didn't need anything else. He filed in court to strip the temporary guardianship, alleging Stefan exploited Jolene's vulnerability, used money to buy consent, and hid everything behind a staged marriage, and then he leaked the story to the media. On Monday morning, Stefan opened his phone and saw the headline on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. Chicago Mafia boss uses arranged marriage to keep 2 orphaned children in luxury penthouse. Orion later said he heard glass shatter before he even had time to open the office door. And when he stepped in, the glass desktop where Stefan worked every day lay in 100 pieces across the floor, Stefan's right hand bleeding, and his boss stood in the middle of the room breathing hard with eyes Orion had seen only once before, the night Stefan discovered the first traitor 10 years earlier, and that traitor hadn't lived through the night. Orion silently handed Stefan a towel to wrap his hand and stood waiting, and Stefan said in a terrifying calm, "Find Knox Wheeler. Bring him to me." Bryn heard the glass break from the living room. She placed Theo in the crib, checked that Phoebe was still asleep, then walked to the office and saw the shards on the floor, the blood on the towel around Stefan's hand, the article glowing on the phone screen amid the broken glass. She read the headline, read the opening lines, and every word was true. That was what hurt most. They weren't lying. They were telling the truth in a way that turned everything into a crime. Bryn looked at Stefan, and this time she wasn't angry, wasn't cold, didn't explode. She was something Stefan had never seen aimed at him before. Pain, the real pain of someone about to lose what she loves. And when she spoke, it wasn't a wife talking to her husband. It was a teammate speaking to a teammate in the middle of a battle. "They're saying our marriage is fake, and they're right. It started fake. But what I feel for the kids is real. She stopped, didn't finish, swallowed the rest down. But Stefan heard what she didn't say louder than what she did, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man standing on the edge of losing everything. Not his empire, not his money, but a penthouse filled with children's laughter and a woman singing lullabies at 3 a.m. "Then help me keep them," he said, voice low. Not an order, not a demand, but the closest Stefan Valenti could come to a plea. "Help me prove it isn't fake." And they both knew he wasn't only talking about the guardianship file. Orion found Knox Wheeler within 24 hours and brought him to the underground basement beneath the Italian restaurant on Taylor Street, the front where tourists ate pasta upstairs, while downstairs, the Valenti empire handled problems that never appeared on paper. Knox sat on an iron chair in the center of the room, hands tied behind his back, one side of his face swollen because Orion wasn't a patient man when a target tried to run. And when Stefan came down the concrete stairs, his shoes striking each step like a countdown, Knox lifted his head and looked at his former boss with eyes Stefan had seen a dozen times on a dozen different faces, the eyes of a man who knows he's about to die. The basement was cold, bare concrete walls, one single bulb, and the smell of dampness mixed with fear so familiar to Stefan he almost didn't notice it anymore. He stopped in front of Knox, arms hanging at his sides, and stared at the traitor with the eyes that, for 15 years, had been the last thing many people ever saw. Knox opened his mouth. "Boss, I can explain." Stefan almost smiled because the line was so familiar it had lost all meaning. Every traitor thinks he can explain. Nobody ever has. Orion stood against the wall, arms folded, waiting for the order he knew was coming because it always came. And the procedure was simple. Stefan gave the word. Orion carried it out. Knox disappeared, and by morning Chicago's underworld would understand that betraying the Valentis ended only one way. Stefan looked at Knox and saw the simplest answer to every problem. Kill Knox and there's no witness for Preston Hale. Nobody to confirm the arranged marriage. Nobody left to threaten the guardianship. One small nod and Orion would handle the rest, and everything would slide back into the old order. The order Stefan had lived by his entire life. But the night before, after the kids were asleep, after Stefan had wrapped his bleeding hand and cleared the shattered glass from his office, Bryn had come and stood at his doorway, the first time she'd stood at his door instead of her own, and she'd said it in a voice that wasn't an order and wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone placing the only thing she had on the table. If you kill one more person, you'll never deserve to be those children's father. She didn't add anything, didn't explain, didn't threaten to leave. She just said it and walked back to her room, and Stefan stood alone in the hallway listening to her door close, knowing that sentence would change everything, or change nothing at all, depending on who he was when nobody was watching. And now he stood here, in the basement, in front of Knox Wheeler, Orion waiting for the word. Everything so familiar he could have done it in his sleep, but in his head it wasn't the South Side or the rules of the underworld. It was Bryn's lullaby to Theo at 3 a.m. It was Phoebe's hand locked around Bryn's at the DCFS office. It was Theo taking 3 steps and falling into his lap. It was everything he'd lose if he stayed the man he'd always been. Stefan stared at Knox a moment longer. Long enough for Knox to start crying. Long enough for Orion to tilt his head slightly because his boss never waited this long. Then Stefan turned to Orion and said, "Call Grant." Orion didn't blink, but his arms uncrossed, and that was the biggest reaction the former Marine had ever shown to shock. Stefan looked back at Knox, and his voice when he spoke wasn't the voice of mercy. It was still the boss's voice, cold and exact. "You're not dying today. Not because I'm sparing you, because you're worth more alive than dead. You're going to sit in front of Grant Whitmore and tell him everything Preston Hale asked you to do. Every meeting, every document you handed over, every promise he made you. And Grant's going to use all of it to make sure Preston Hale never touches my family." Knox stared at Stefan like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. And Orion stared at Stefan like he was seeing a completely new version of his boss he'd never met in 8 years. Grant arrived within an hour with a recorder and a notebook, and Knox confessed everything. That Preston Hale had approached him through an undercover FBI agent, that Hale promised immunity if Knox delivered internal information, that Hale specifically wanted proof of the arranged marriage and the children because it was the easiest spear to drive into public opinion, and that Hale's approach violated at least 3 federal procedures for handling confidential informants. Grant wrote it all down, shut off the recorder, looked at Stefan, and for the first time in 30 years, the old lawyer smiled. "Enough," he said. "Enough to countersue. Enough to ask the court to throw out any evidence Preston Hale collected through Knox. And enough to protect the guardianship." Stefan nodded, then walked up the stairs and left the basement. And when he pushed the door open, the Chicago night air cut cold across his face, but he pulled it into his lungs like a man breaking the surface after nearly drowning. He didn't spare Knox because he'd become a good man. He knew he wasn't a good man, and maybe never would be, but he chose control instead of destruction for the first time. Not because it was more profitable, but because one woman had looked at him long enough to see what else he could be, and because 2 children had taught him that real strength isn't the power to kill whoever you want. It's the ability not to kill when you can. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning at Family Court, the Richard J. Daley Center in downtown Chicago, courtroom 712, on the 7th floor. A room much smaller than people imagine when they think of a case involving a mafia boss. Nothing but oak tables, hard chairs, the Illinois flag on one side and the American flag on the other, and fluorescent light that fell on everyone with a ruthless honesty that spared no one. Stefan sat on the left beside Grant Whitmore, wearing a gray suit instead of black because Grant warned that black looked too much like a funeral or a criminal trial, and he sat straight-backed with a calm that only Orion in the back row knew was an act. Bryn sat beside Stefan, hands resting on her lap, posture rigid, face blank, and to anyone watching they looked like a composed couple, but under the table, her knee was shaking, and she clenched her hands together to force it to stop. Preston Hale sat across from them, 50 years old, short-cut gray hair, the angular face of a man who'd spent his whole career believing he was the only good person in the room, and he watched Stefan the way a hunter watches prey when the trap has already snapped shut. The judge called the case, and Preston Hale stood at once, wasting no time, striking from the first sentence. He argued that Stefan Valenti, under the cover of a legitimate CEO, brought 2 abandoned children into his home without reporting to authorities, that he used money to obtain the biological mother's consent, and that Stefan's marriage to Bryn was a staged financial arrangement designed to create a family front for a guardianship petition. Stefan was called to the stand, and Preston Hale stepped closer, close enough to make it feel like he wanted Stefan to smell his confidence. "Mr. Valenti, you can't have children, can you? I have medical records confirming you were diagnosed as infertile. So isn't it true you found 2 children and saw an opportunity to fill what nature denied you?" The courtroom went silent. Grant moved to object, but Stefan glanced at him and gave a small shake of his head. Then Stefan looked at Preston Hale, not with a boss's eyes, but with the eyes Bryn had seen the night he sat in the dark staring at his grandfather's portrait, and he said, "Yes, I can't have children. That's the truth I live with every day. A doctor told me 6 years ago, and I've carried it ever since like a sentence with no crime I can appeal." The room went so quiet you could hear the court reporter's pen pause. Stefan continued, "But not being able to create a child doesn't mean I can't love a child. Phoebe and Theo aren't replacements for the child I'll never have. They're themselves, and they deserve to be loved for who they are, not for the empty space inside me. When I found them in that warehouse that night, I wasn't thinking about statutes. I was thinking about keeping them alive, and I'd do the same thing again if I could go back." Bryn sat below with her eyes burning, because this was the first time Stefan had spoken the truth of his infertility out loud, not to her in the dark of the penthouse, but in front of the whole courtroom, in front of the judge, in front of Preston Hale, in front of the world. And she realized he'd just exposed the deepest weakness of his life, not because he was forced, but because he chose to, because 2 children were worth taking off armor he'd worn for 15 years. Preston Hale didn't flinch. He pivoted, called Bryn to the stand, and the moment she sat in the witness chair, he asked without circling it, "Mrs. Valenti, was your marriage to the respondent a financial arrangement? Did you sign the marriage license to erase the debt your brother left behind?" The silence in the courtroom grew so heavy Bryn could hear her own heartbeat. She looked at Preston Hale, then at Stefan, at the defense table, watching her with eyes that didn't ask her to lie and didn't beg her to tell the truth, only watched. Then she looked toward the back row where Phoebe sat beside the social worker, a 7-year-old in a new dress Bryn had bought. Hair braided by Bryn, arms wrapped around the stuffed bear Stefan had brought home one night without explanation, and Phoebe was watching Bryn with eyes that weren't as old as they'd been that first night, but still carried the caution of a child who knows anything can be taken at any time. Bryn turned back to the judge and said, "Our marriage began for reasons I'm not proud of. That's true, and I won't lie to the court. But if you ask me right now whether Stefan Valenti is my husband, the answer is yes. Not because of a piece of paper, but because I chose to stay. I chose this family. I chose the 2 children who sleep in our home every night. I chose the man who sat up all night beside a feverish little girl and walked a newborn back and forth across the living room at 6 in the morning. And if that isn't real enough for you, then I don't know what real is." Preston Hale opened his mouth to continue, but the judge lifted a hand, and in that moment, Bryn looked at Stefan and saw him looking back at her. And on the face of a man half of Chicago feared, there was nothing but something it had taken her 18 months to recognize. Not power, not control, but the quiet gratitude of a man who'd just been chosen for the first time in his life. Jolene was called to the stand right after Bryn, and as she walked down the aisle of the courtroom, Stefan could see she was different from the day at the DCFS office. Still thin, but her back was straighter, her eyes still hollow but brighter, and she wore a clean white button-up blouse someone at the shelter had lent her, buttoned all the way to her throat, as if she were trying to keep the last scrap of dignity she had and carry it into this room. Preston Hale stood, adjusted his tie, approached Jolene with the confident stride of a man who believed this would be the easiest witness to break, and he began. "Miss Perry, were you coerced into signing the guardianship consent? Did you receive money or any kind of financial support from Mr. Valenti in exchange for your children?" Jolene looked at Preston Hale, then at her own attorney in the corner, then ignored them both and turned her face straight to the judge. and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake the way it had at the DCFS office. It was flat and steady, the voice of someone who's already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. I'm Phoebe and Theo's mother. I carried them. I gave birth to them. I love them. But I'm also the one who left them in that warehouse for 3 days because I didn't have food for them. I didn't have a safe place to sleep. I didn't have any way to escape the people who controlled me. And when I tried to go find help, I got caught and locked up. So don't ask me if I was coerced. My life has been a long chain of coercion. But the decision to let my children stay with that man was the freest decision I've ever made. Preston Hale opened his mouth like he was going to cut her off, but Jolene didn't stop. Her voice rose a little, not a shout, just enough that every word hit the courtroom walls and came back. He didn't buy my children. He saved them from me. And the woman sitting there, she pointed toward Bryn, is the woman my daughter trusts. Phoebe holds her hand, not mine. That hurts worse than anything I've ever lived through. But it also means my child is safe. And if Your Honor takes them from that family today, you're sentencing Phoebe and Theo to go through again the very thing they just escaped. I'm their mother, and the hardest decision of my life was letting them go, because I love them too much to keep them in pain. Please don't turn my pain into a political weapon. Jolene turned to Preston Hale, stared straight into his eyes, and asked, "Do you have kids?" Preston Hale froze. For the first time all morning, he froze, and he didn't answer, but his jaw tightened, and Jolene continued, "If you do, then you know being a parent sometimes means letting go. That's what I'm doing. Don't use it against me." The judge made notes, face unreadable, then called a recess so the court psychologist could interview Phoebe privately. Phoebe was led into a small room at the end of the hallway, the door shutting behind her, and Stefan and Bryn sat on plastic chairs outside and waited. 40 minutes, Grant said. It usually doesn't take longer than that. But 40 minutes in a courthouse hallway when your family's future sits behind a closed door is longer than 40 years. Stefan sat still, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. And at minute 5 he reached his hand to the right, without looking, without speaking, just offered it. Bryn looked at that hand, the hand that had signed death orders, shattered a glass desk, trembled mixing formula for a newborn, and now lay between them on a courthouse bench, with the palm turned upward, and she placed her hand in it, and he closed his fingers around hers. And they sat like that through the remaining 35 minutes without a single word. The door opened. Phoebe walked out, eyes red but not crying, and she went straight to Stefan and Bryn, slid in between them, sat down, and didn't say a word. Everyone was called back into the courtroom. The judge took the bench, adjusted his glasses, opened the file, and began in the even tone of someone who'd read thousands of rulings but weighed every word in this one. This is a complex case. I've reviewed the medical reports, showing both children were severely malnourished when found. The infant boy showed signs of dehydration that were life-threatening. I've reviewed the psychological report indicating the child Phoebe has strong emotional attachment to both guardians. She addresses them in the way children address only people they trust. I've heard testimony from the biological mother confirming voluntary consent without coercion. And I've reviewed evidence submitted by the respondents showing procedural violations in how the prosecutor gathered information. He paused, looked at Preston Hale, then looked at Stefan and Bryn. I deny the motion to remove guardianship. Temporary guardianship remains in place, and the court authorizes the start of formal adoption proceedings. The gavel came down, and Bryn bowed her head, both hands covering her mouth, shoulders shaking, and Stefan sat perfectly still like if he moved the ruling would dissolve into smoke. Phoebe looked at them, then climbed into Bryn's lap, and Bryn held her and cried without being able to stop, and Stefan set his hand on both their backs without speaking because he didn't trust his voice right now. Outside the courthouse on the concrete steps, Jolene waited. She'd cried every tear she had left in the courtroom, so her face was dry and calm now. Phoebe ran to hug her, and Jolene hugged her back, breathed in the smell of her daughter's hair, then let her go, brushed her cheek, and said, "Be good, baby. I'll visit. I'm going to get clean all the way. I'm going to start over." When Phoebe turned back toward Bryn, Stefan stepped close to Jolene and pulled a white envelope from the inside pocket of his suit and handed it to her. Jolene took the envelope and looked at him without opening it. Stefan said, "There's money in there, and the address of a rehab center in the suburbs. I paid the full cost up front. This isn't payment. This is because your daughter's going to ask about her mother, and I want to have a better answer." Jolene looked at the envelope, then at Stefan, then at Phoebe holding Bryn's hand at the bottom of the steps, and she nodded once, slipped the envelope into her blouse pocket, then turned and walked down the street without looking back, because she knew if she looked at her daughter one more time, her legs wouldn't have the strength to keep moving forward. 2 weeks after the hearing, Phoebe asked Stefan a question at dinner that made him set his fork down and never pick it up again. "What do you do for work, Dad?" She was 7, asking because her classmates said their dads were doctors, engineers, plumbers, and she didn't know what to say. And the question was simple in a way that was cruel, because Stefan didn't have an answer he could give a 7-year-old without lying. Bryn sat across from him and didn't help, didn't rescue him, only watched, because she knew this was a fight he had to take on himself. Stefan looked at Phoebe and said, "I do business," then changed the subject. But that night after the kids were asleep, he sat alone in his office for a long time, and the next morning he called Grant Whitmore and said 3 words that made Grant ask him to repeat them, because he didn't believe he'd heard right. Scale it back. Over the next 3 months, Stefan pulled out of the underground gambling line that had brought in millions every quarter, cut the entire protection system on the south side, transferred the nightclub fronts to someone else, and poured money into legitimate real estate and the restaurant chain Valenti Holdings had always owned, but never treated as the priority. Orion didn't ask why, because Orion never asked, but Grant did, and Stefan answered with the sentence the old lawyer wrote in his notebook and underlined twice, "Because the kid asked me what I do, and I don't want to lie to her forever." Bryn knew, not because Stefan told her, but because she saw him come home earlier, saw him at the table at 6 in the evening instead of 10 at night, saw him read to Phoebe before bed instead of disappearing into his office. And she noticed his phone rang less. Orion stood outside the door with a face that looked less tense. The midnight meetings stopped happening, and she wasn't naive. She knew Stefan couldn't wash 15 years of blood away with a few months of legal business, but she could see he was trying. And for Bryn Calloway, who'd grown up in a world where nobody ever tried for her, someone trying was enough to let something inside her shift. The change in their marriage didn't come with one big moment. It came in things so small they were almost invisible. Stefan started pouring 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1. Bryn started staying at the dining table after the kids finished eating instead of disappearing into her room. They started talking about Phoebe, about Theo, about doctor appointments, homework, and those conversations about the kids slowly widened into conversations about everything else. Not many, not deep, but they existed, and their existence was a kind of miracle inside a marriage whose first 18 months had been nothing but silence. Then one night the kids went down early because Phoebe was exhausted after a school field trip, and Theo was teething and had fussed all day before collapsing at 7. Stefan sat on the sofa reading documents, and Bryn sat beside him reading a book. No 12-seat table between them, just 2 people on one couch with 1 cushion of space. And at some point no one could name exactly. Bryn drifted off, her head tilting, then settling against Stefan's shoulder, and he went rigid for 1 second, and then didn't move again. Not for the next 3 hours, even as his neck cramped and his arm went numb, because he was afraid that if he shifted she'd wake up and leave, and this moment would never come back. The next morning Bryn woke and realized she'd slept on her husband's shoulder all night, and she sat up straight, looked at Stefan watching her with dark circles from staying awake, and she didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't pretend it hadn't happened. She only said, "Coffee," and Stefan understood that it wasn't a question about coffee. It was Bryn Calloway's way of saying I'm staying without putting feelings into words, because neither of them were good at that. A few nights later, after the kids were asleep, Stefan sat on the balcony looking at the Chicago skyline. City lights spread below like a bright carpet he used to think he owned, but now he only saw as beautiful, and Bryn stepped out and sat beside him. 2 chairs on a balcony that for 2 years had never held both of them at once. She looked at the city, then at him, and asked, "Are you scared?" Stefan looked at her. "Scared of what?" Bryn said, "Scared to love." Silence stretched. Wind off Lake Michigan swept the balcony with cold breath, and Stefan looked at the skyline, then spoke slowly. "I'm scared to lose. I'm scared to lose the kids. I'm scared to lose." He stopped, looked at her, and for the first time in 2 years he didn't call her by her name or avoid naming her at all. "I'm scared to lose you." Bryn didn't speak. She only put her hand on his on the armrest, and he turned his palm up to receive hers, and they sat like that, fingers intertwined, the Chicago skyline ahead, the steady breathing of two sleeping children drifting from the living room behind them. No kiss, no confession, no grand promises. Only two broken people learning how to touch without being afraid of getting cut. 6 months after the hearing, on a Saturday morning in early June, when Chicago warmed up enough to make people want to go outside, Stefan told Bryn he wanted to take the kids on a picnic at Millennium Park, and Bryn looked at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language, because in the 2 years she'd known him, she'd never once heard him use the word picnic. But she nodded. She packed snacks into a bag, dressed Phoebe in the floral dress the girl had picked for herself at the store the week before, changed Theo, and the four of them stepped into the elevator looking, for the first time, like a family instead of 4 people who happened to live in the same place. Orion drove the Escalade ahead. Another SUV carrying 2 bodyguards followed behind, because Stefan Valenti might have been shrinking the Empire, but enemies don't shrink on command. And Orion parked a short distance from the main lawn at Millennium Park, leaned against the vehicle with a cold face, arms folded, eyes sweeping every direction, the gun hidden under his jacket ready for anything except what he actually ended up witnessing that afternoon. Bryn spread a blanket on the grass near Crown Fountain, placed Theo on it, and Stefan sat down beside her awkwardly, because a Chicago Mafia boss didn't have any memory of sitting on grass in a public park on a Saturday afternoon, and his legs didn't know how to fold themselves into comfort. Phoebe stood on the blanket and looked around, at the wide-open lawn with other families playing, at kids running, at a blue sky that wasn't blocked by concrete walls or a metal roof. Then she kicked off her shoes, put her bare feet into the grass, felt each blade against the sole that had been infected a year ago, and then she ran. Not running away, not running to find food, not running because she was scared. Running because she was 7 and the lawn was wide and the sky was blue, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to run to anywhere at all. She could just run. And a laugh came out of her, loud, clear, real, a laugh Stefan had never heard because every other time Phoebe laughed it had been small, careful, a guarded laugh from a child who still wasn't fully sure she was allowed to be happy. But this laugh was different. It rose from her belly and rang across the grass, and Stefan heard it and felt something crack open in his chest in a way he didn't want to seal back up. Theo sat on the blanket watching his sister run, eyes wide. Then he crawled off the blanket, grabbed a fistful of grass and shoved it into his mouth, face scrunching at the strange taste, and Bryn laughed as she pulled the grass back out, while Stefan watched his 2 children in the middle of a park in the middle of Chicago, and thought, this is what I bought a city and still couldn't buy. Phoebe ran back, cheeks flushed, breathing hard, sweat sticking her hair to her forehead, and she dropped onto the blanket between Stefan and Bryn. She looked at Bryn, then at Stefan, then back at Bryn, and she asked in the same ordinary tone she'd used to ask about the weather. But her eyes weren't ordinary at all. Miss Bryn, you're my mom, right? Bryn froze with her hand still wiping Theo's face, and the world around them seemed to soften. The park noise, the fountain music, the wind, everything fading into the background, until only the question of a 7-year-old hung in the air. Bryn glanced at Stefan, and in his eyes she saw the answer he wanted to give, but was leaving to her, because he understood this wasn't his decision. Bryn knelt in the grass at Phoebe's eye level, the way she'd knelt in front of her that first night in the penthouse, took both of Phoebe's hands, and said, you have 2 moms. Jolene brought you into this world, and Jolene loves you more than you know. And Bryn, she paused, swallowed something tight in her throat. Bryn will be here. Bryn will always be here. Phoebe looked at her with eyes that were less old than they'd been a year ago. Then she wrapped her arms around Bryn's neck, and Bryn held her back, and Stefan sat there watching with eyes stinging so badly he couldn't see clearly. Then Phoebe reached for Stefan's hand and pulled him in, and the 3 of them held each other on the grass in Millennium Park in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, and Theo crawled over and slapped Stefan's shin, and laughed because he didn't understand what was happening, but he knew everyone he loved was in one place, and that was enough. Orion stood by the SUV 30 meters away, face still cold as stone, eyes still scanning for threats. But at some point he'd pulled out his phone and taken a picture. 4 people on the grass, afternoon sunlight, the Chicago skyline behind them, and he slid the phone back into his pocket and returned to guarding like nothing had happened. That night, Stefan asked Orion to send him the photo, had it printed, framed in simple wood, and hung it on the living room wall right beside the portrait of his grandfather, the wall that for 2 years had held only one photograph of the man who built the empire and regretted he wouldn't see it continue, now held a second one, 4 people on grass, and Stefan stood looking at the two frames side by side and spoke softly, so no one heard. "Grandpa, I found it." 5 months after that picnic, the adoption was finalized. The judge signed the papers, and Phoebe and Theo officially carried the Valenti name, and that night Phoebe asked Stefan if that meant he'd never give her back, and Stefan said never, and she nodded and went to sleep, like that was all she needed. The years that followed moved in a rhythm the penthouse had never known before. The rhythm of family, messy, loud, imperfect, and beautiful. When Phoebe turned 10, she asked Stefan to take her to the warehouse where he'd found her 4 years earlier. Stefan drove down to the south side with Bryn in the passenger seat and Phoebe in back, and when they arrived, the warehouse was gone. The entire lot had been cleared and replaced by a 3-story cream-colored social housing complex with a children's playground in the middle, a project Stefan had quietly funded through a charity that didn't carry the Valenti name because he hadn't done it to be seen. Phoebe stood on the sidewalk, looking at the new building, trying to remember the old warehouse, but the memory had already started to blur the way childhood memories blur when they're replaced by better ones, and she said, "This is the place, right, Dad?" And Stefan nodded, and Phoebe went quiet for a moment, then said, "I remember being so scared. I remember holding Theo and thinking we were going to die here. Then you came, and everything changed." Stefan held his daughter's hand and didn't speak because he didn't need to, and Bryn stood behind them with her hand on Phoebe's shoulder, and the three of them stood on the sidewalk looking at something new rising from old ashes. A year later, on the penthouse rooftop, on a September night, when the Chicago air had turned cold enough for a jacket, but not cold enough to go inside, Stefan and Bryn married again. Not the first time they'd married, but the first time for love. There were no guests except Orion as best man, face cold as stone but eyes a little wet that he would deny until he died. Grant Whitmore as a witness, Dr. Faith Nguyen in the front row, Phoebe in a white dress holding flowers, and Theo, 5 years old, carrying the rings on a small pillow he nearly dropped twice. Bryn wore a simple white dress, not an expensive wedding gown, just a dress she'd chosen in a regular store, because she said this time she wanted everything to be real and not a performance, and when she stepped onto the rooftop with Phoebe leading her in, Stefan looked at her and cried. Orion watched his boss cry, and his face twitched slightly, because in 10 years with Stefan, he'd never seen this. Never once, and Grant had to turn away and wipe his eyes with a handkerchief, because he was old, and tears don't listen anymore. Stefan cried not because he was sad, but because he watched the woman walking toward him, and remembered that 2 years earlier she'd signed the marriage papers with an ice-cold face in a lawyer's office, and now she was smiling, holding flowers, and walking toward him because she wanted to. Not because of debt, not because of a deal, because she chose him. And Stefan Valenti had never been chosen for love in his life. Phoebe entered her teens and started asking about Jolene, not in anger or bitterness, but with the curiosity of a girl trying to understand where she came from. Stefan and Bryn answered honestly, telling her about the circumstances, the ring, the desperation, the love Jolene had but didn't have the life to show. And when Phoebe said she wanted to meet Jolene, they helped her find her. Jolene had gotten clean, lived in Milwaukee, worked in the kitchen of a small diner, rented a clean 1-bedroom apartment, and when Phoebe walked into that diner on a Sunday afternoon, Jolene stood behind the counter and saw her daughter taller, healthier, brighter, then stepped out and held her and cried in silence. And Phoebe held her back this time, not with the defensive arms of a 6-year-old, but with the embrace of a teenager who understood her mother hadn't left because she didn't love her. She'd left because she loved her too much with too little to offer. Bryn stood outside the diner looking through the glass, holding Stefan's hand, and she didn't go in, because she knew that moment belonged to mother and daughter. Theo grew fast. The chubby baby who learned to walk in the penthouse was now a 12-year-old boy approaching Phoebe's height, obsessed with basketball, always moving, and Stefan didn't miss a single one of his son's school games. Sitting in the bleachers with Bryn, both of them looking out of place among ordinary parents, but nobody cared because Theo was scoring, and that was the only thing that mattered. But one night Theo sat at the dinner table, pushed his plate aside, and said, "I'm different from my friends. They have newborn photos, hospital videos, stories about day one. I don't have any of that." Stefan set his fork down, looked at his son, and said, "You've got something better than baby pictures. You've got a photo of 4 people on the grass at Millennium Park, the day you took your first 3 steps and fell into my lap. You've got a story about a night in a warehouse where your sister held you for 3 days and didn't let go. You've got a story about a mother who loved you enough to let you go, and another mother who chose you when nobody forced her to choose. You've got a story about love that outlives blood, and I promise you no newborn photo on earth is worth more than that story." Theo looked at his dad, then at Bryn in the kitchen doorway, wiping her eyes and pretending it was onions, then at Phoebe nodding, and he didn't say anything else. He just pulled his plate back and kept eating. But that night he hugged Stefan longer than usual before bed, and that was the only answer Stefan needed. Phoebe graduated high school as valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to Northwestern for pre-med, and the ceremony was held in the school's big auditorium, with hundreds of parents filling the seats, but Stefan saw only one person on that stage. An 18-year-old girl in a dark blue gown, her mortarboard slightly crooked, standing at the microphone with eyes that weren't old the way they'd been that night in the warehouse, but still carried the depth of someone who'd lived more than her years should have allowed. Bryn sat beside Stefan, her hand wrapped around his, eyes already red before Phoebe even stepped up. Jolene sat a few rows back beside Dr. Faith, wearing a new blouse she'd bought with her cook's paycheck in Milwaukee, hair cut short and neat, over a decade clean, her fingers crushing the graduation program where the name Phoebe Valenti was printed in black ink on white paper. Theo sat next to Orion, 12 years old, long legs hooked over the seat in front, while Orion sat ramrod straight with a face like stone but tissue tucked in his jacket, because he'd been to enough Valenti family events to know he'd need it. Phoebe held the mic, looked out over the hall, and began in a steady voice that only the people who'd known her from the beginning understood was built from nights of fear and years of being loved. "I want to thank 3 people in particular," Phoebe said, her gaze searching for faces in the crowd. "First, my mom Jolene, the woman who brought me into this world and loved me enough to let go. You gave me the hardest thing a mother can give, freedom to live better, and I want you to know I'll never forget that." Jolene bowed her head in the back row, shoulders shaking, and Dr. Faith put a hand on her back. Phoebe continued. "Next, my dad Stefan, the man who knelt in the mud outside a warehouse and chose me when the world walked past. You're not perfect. You'd be the first to admit that, but you chose me and Theo on a night when nobody else did, and you changed everything you used to be to deserve that choice. I love you, Dad." Stefan sat perfectly still, jaw locked, eyes fixed on his daughter on that stage without blinking, and Bryn felt his hand tighten around hers until it almost hurt, but she didn't pull away. Phoebe turned her eyes to Bryn, and her voice softened just a little. "And finally, my mom Bryn, who was also once a child nobody chose, who knows what it's like to grow up in a system where you're unwanted, and because of that, you chose me, because you looked at me and saw yourself, and you decided I wouldn't have to live the life you lived. Family isn't decided by blood, it's decided by choice, and I was chosen by extraordinary people." The auditorium applauded, but Stefan didn't hear it. He only heard Bryn crying beside him and Jolene crying behind him, and Phoebe's voice echoing through the speakers. And he thought about the skinny child holding her baby brother in that warehouse, and how she was standing on a stage now, and he thought about how kneeling in the mud that night was the only decision of his life he hadn't needed to think through, and also the only decision he'd never regretted for even a second. The years after that were Phoebe in med school at Northwestern, white nights in the library, weekend shifts at a teaching hospital, and when she graduated as a doctor, she didn't choose a glossy private hospital or an expensive specialty practice. She went back to the public hospital on the south side, where Bryn had once worked, where abandoned kids were brought into the emergency room at midnight and needed someone to see them as human and not a file. "I know what it feels like to be forgotten by the world," Phoebe told Stefan when he asked why she didn't choose somewhere better. "I want to be the person who shows up for those kids, the way you showed up for me." Theo took his own path. He didn't go pro in basketball even though he had the talent. Instead, he started a nonprofit that taught basketball to kids on the south side, using the sport as a bridge to pull them away from the street. And when Stefan asked where the idea came from, Theo grinned and said, "You and Mom taught me that having resources means having responsibility. I'm just doing what you showed me." Theo married, and he and his wife adopted a 5-year-old girl from the foster care system, continuing the circle Stefan began in the warehouse that night. And the first time Stefan held his adopted granddaughter, he looked into her watchful eyes and saw Phoebe, saw himself, saw Bryn, saw every child nobody wanted who finally found a home. The penthouse wasn't quiet anymore. Every Sunday it was full. Phoebe brought her husband and kids. Theo brought his wife and adopted daughter. Dr. Faith dropped by once a month. Grant got older but still came to drink whiskey with Stefan on the balcony. And Jolene was there every Sunday, in the kitchen helping Bryn cook, the two women laughing together with the easy comfort of people who'd survived something nobody else could fully understand. Two mothers loving the same children in different ways, with nobody needing to compare. Because love isn't a competition. Many years later, Stefan Valenti sat on the penthouse balcony, with hair gone completely white, the hands that once trembled while mixing formula in a pharmacy at midnight now resting still on the chair's armrests, and beside him was Bryn, her hair threaded with silver too, her eyes needing reading glasses now, but her smile still the same smile she gave him for the first time on the grass at Millennium Park, the day Phoebe asked if Bryn was her mom. Inside the penthouse, laughter spilled through a glass door left slightly open. Phoebe was having dinner with her husband and two small children. Theo was arguing over a game controller with his adopted daughter. Jolene was in the kitchen laughing with Theo's wife about a new recipe, loud, chaotic, and perfect. The penthouse that once held only darkness, and two strangers sitting at opposite ends of a 12-seat table, now didn't have enough chairs for everyone. Bryn looked out at the Chicago skyline, then turned to Stefan and asked in the gentle voice of someone who didn't need an answer, but wanted to hear it anyway. "Do you regret anything?" Stefan thought for a moment, then said, "One thing. I should have married you for love from the start, instead of losing almost 2 years, living like strangers under the same roof." Bryn laughed, a soft, warm laugh that belonged there. "If that had happened, I wouldn't have hated you long enough to learn how hard it was to love you." Stefan looked at her and thought he wanted to hear that laugh until his last day. Inside, Phoebe's 25th birthday was happening in the same penthouse where the barefoot, half-starved little girl had first stepped in 19 years ago and asked if she would dirty the car. And now it was where she celebrated with family, with people she loved. And Stefan looked through the doorway and saw his daughter laughing. 25, a pediatrician. Healthy, happy, and he still wasn't used to that feeling. The feeling that a child he'd found dying in a warehouse was now laughing in his home. Phoebe stepped onto the balcony with a glass of water, stood beside Stefan, leaned on the railing, looked down at the city lights, and said, "Dad, I want to ask you something. If you could go back to that night, knowing everything that would happen, the hearings, the media, Knox's betrayal, Preston Hale, the sleepless nights, all of it, would you still walk into that warehouse?" Stefan didn't hesitate. He set his glass down, turned to his daughter, cupped her face between both hands, hands that had carried blood, shattered glass, signed orders he wasn't proud of, and now only knew how to hold, and he said, "I'd walk into that warehouse again. I'd kneel in the mud again. I'd say the same words again, 1,000 times, without changing a thing. Finding you and Theo was the only decision in my life I'd do again, without altering a single detail. That decision gave me 2 children. It gave me a reason to truly love your mom, Bryn, instead of living forever like 2 shadows. And today I know the truly rich man isn't the one with the most money in a bank or the most power on the street. It's the one brave enough to stop when the whole world keeps walking. It's the one who chooses love when leaving would be easier. Because you weren't only children I saved. You were the angels who taught me that real wealth fits inside one family gathered around one table." Phoebe hugged him, and Bryn stepped close and placed her hand on both their backs. And from inside, Theo shouted, "Dad, come eat cake! It's almost gone!" And all 3 of them laughed and walked back inside, into the light, into the noise, into the family. Stefan paused at the balcony door for 1 second, looked back at the Chicago skyline one more time, the city he once thought he owned, then looked into the bright penthouse where Bryn was holding a grandchild, Phoebe was cutting cake, Theo was laughing, Jolene was clearing plates, and he understood that the greatest empire he'd ever built wasn't made of money or blood. It was made of a love he'd almost never learned how to receive, a love that began with a fake marriage, 2 filthy children, and one night kneeling in the mud. This story may not only be Stefan and Bryn's story. It's a reminder to all of us that real family isn't built by blood or paperwork, but by courageous choices in moments that look ordinary on the surface, that sometimes the strongest person isn't the one who never breaks, but the one who dares to kneel, dares to open a heart, dares to love when the whole world says they shouldn't. If this story touched something in your heart, please like and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to know how you felt after hearing this story. Have you ever had a moment in your life where one small choice changed everything? Share it with us in the comments below. We read and cherish every message from the deepest part of your hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.